Welcome back. This is session number 2 of the 2018 Virtual Genealogy Fair. It is for all skill levels and entitled Federal Records that Help Identify Former Slaves and Slave Owners. Our speaker is Claire Kluskens. Ms. Kluskens is a reference and digital projects archivist at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and specializes in records of high genealogical value. Welcome to the stage, Claire Kluskens.
Thank you, Brittany, and good morning, and welcome to everyone in attendance with us today. It's my pleasure to present this session on federal records that help identify former slaves and slave owners. Before we get started talking about records, I'd like to talk about some of the principles of successful genealogical research. Successful research requires reasonably exhaustive research, searching in all the records that relate to the time and place in which an ancestor lived. It involves researching not only the direct ancestor, but also their fan club, their family. The direct ancestor has siblings, uncles, aunts, nieces, nephews, other people in the family that may have created records that provide information about the direct ancestor. They have neighbors, too, that may very well be related, but it may also provide information about the direct ancestor. You also need to research in all records. Records are created by government at all levels, federal, state, county, local, and by private organizations such as churches and cemeteries and newspapers. Many people think that all records are online. This is certainly not true, and certainly different databases also have different records in them. Some people think that if they type a name into a database and don't quote unquote find anything, that there is nothing to find, and that is not true. It requires an understanding of the records to successfully ferret out all the information in them. I'm going to start with the federal population census for 1790 to 1940. Census records are basic building blocks for everyone's research, regardless of race or ethnic background. Start with the 1940 census and work your way backwards. Locate every ancestor and relative in every census in which they were alive to the extent possible. Because the census is taken at 10-year intervals, it gives you a timeline, the basic outline of a timeline of the ancestor's life. And so that will be helpful in filling out other spots in that ancestor's timeline. The 2015 Genealogy Fair includes a presentation on Introduction to Genealogy at the National Archives. That includes a lengthy section on census research that features an African American family, and I recommend your attention to that. Although the census started in 1790, it has fairly little information for 1790 through 1840. It includes the names of heads of household with other free white persons listed in categories by age and gender, and slaves likewise are listed in categories by age and gender. So there aren't a whole lot of names, but yet it is still a basic building block for that early period of time. From 1850 to 1860, all free persons are listed by name with their age, gender, marital status, state or country of birth, and amount of real property and personal property owned, if any. For 1870 to 1940, you get a lot more detail with every person listed by name with their age, gender, marital status, state or country of birth. State or country of birth for each person's parents is also included in the 1880 and 1900 through 1930 censuses. You also get occupation and other information. Unfortunately, the 1890 census was mostly destroyed as a result of a fire in 1921. Information for about 6,160 persons survive. Therefore, most people have to take the 20-year leap from 1900 back to 1880. So it is very important that you do complete census research for the period 1900 and afterwards in order to make that leap possible. And we have more information about the 1890 census on our website. Things to keep in mind when you're doing your census research is that names may not be spelled the way you expect. People were not necessarily asked how to spell their name when in many cases didn't know how to spell their name anyways. Ages, birthplaces, relationships may be reported differently in different censuses depending upon the knowledge of the person providing the information to the enumerator. Only the 1940 census tells you which person provided that information to the enumerator. All the earlier censuses, you don't have any idea who provided the information. It could be the mom, the dad, the grandma, the 16-year-old kid, the next door neighbor. You don't know who provided the information, and so there is wide variations from census year to census year. It's also important to recognize that African American families may be reported under different surnames in 1870 than in 1880. So I'm going to give you an example of that. This is the Hilliard Livingston family in 1880 in Alabama. So we have Hill Livingston with his wife Mary and several children listed here. And I'll also point out that if you have a family that starts at the bottom of one census page, please go to the next page because the family may very well continue on to the next page, as the Livingston family does here. That may seem like an obvious thing, but I've seen people not do that, so I'd like to mention that. So in 1880, this is the Livingston family. Go back to 1870, and you have Mary Alexander with children Melissa, George, and Clarence. Hilliard Livingston, the dad of 1880, is listed under his surname, Livingston. Why the Alexanders are listed as Alexander instead of Livingston, I don't know. Was it a second marriage for Mary Alexander? I don't know. Did they have different owners during slave times? I don't know. But it's important to recognize that names were not necessarily fixed, that they were fluid, and sometimes people flip back and forth between different names. Moving on now to the federal slave census schedules for 1850 and 1860, provide some information, although usually not their names. For each slave owner, it indicates the number of slaves owned, the age, gender, and color of the slaves, the number of slave houses on that owner's property, and in some cases, if the slave is deaf and dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic, or whether the slave owner freed any slaves in the year previously, or if the slave owner had any fugitive slaves. So this is part of a page from the 1860 slave schedule for Warren County, Mississippi, with Jeff Davis, who became president of the Confederacy, down at the lower right. And I'm going to enlarge this here to show you that on occasion you do get a slave name. Here we have Robert, who is 104, and I guess that's why the enumerator provided his name, because he was very old. But that's not typical. At the far right, you see that there were 28 slave houses on Jefferson Davis's property, and his list of slaves goes on for a couple pages, so he was a very wealthy man. Slavery in other places was different. This is Stafford County, Virginia in 1860, where you see that many slave owners only own one slave or just a few slaves. And I'd like to enlarge this because to show you something else that you might find if you look very closely. In this slide on the left side where it says A.S. Mason, you see that A.S. Mason has 5 slaves, and the number of slaves houses total for his property is 2. But the enumerator has chosen to indicate the head of the slave household so that you know from this that the 43-year-old female is the head of one household and the 22-year-old female is the head of another slave household. So although you don't know which households the children were in, that at least gives you some indication of how the people were broken out. And let's see, I'm going to go back to this one. And the other thing you find from this, if you look closely, is that in this location, some of the slaves, where they only had one slave, actually lived in the master's house. On the right-hand side, there are 5 slave owners listed, but there's only one slave house listed. So my conclusion is that the slaves in the other 4 households actually lived in the master's house. So that provides you some information about the living arrangements on those places. This is, again, another page from Stafford County, where, again, on the left side, you see E. Ann Green as the slave owner, and there are 4 slave houses listed with the head of each slave house indicated. So it's useful information. Again, names are lacking, but at least it gives you some details. I'd like to move on to Civil War and later military pension files, which you'll learn more about in the next hour's presentation. There were thousands of African American men who served in the Union Army and the U.S. colored troops, as well as in the U.S. Navy. I recommend that you start with the pension files first before looking for service records, simply because the pension files contain more information about the serviceman and his family. And if you have an ancestor with a common name like John Smith, it's a lot easier to determine whether you have the right John Smith by looking at the additional personal information in the pension file than it is in trying to figure that out with the more basic information in the service record. There are a couple indexes to pension files. One of them, National Archives Microfilm Publication T288. General index to pension files is found online on a couple of websites. And when you find that index online, this is what you see. There are individual cards. Here's a card, index card for John Smith, whose alias is James A. Reynolds. He served in Company F of the 9th U.S. Colored Troops Infantry. You see that he filed for his pension on August 13, 1890. The way the pension office worked was when you filed for a pension, your application got a number, which is what's shown in the left column there under application number. We call that the SO number for survivor's original. When your pension application was finally approved, the file got an entirely new number, the SC number for survivor's certificate. That's shown there on the right. This man lived in Maryland. He applied from Maryland. That's what you can tell from the state from which filed. Now this man turned out to be fairly long-lived, and he lived until the 1930s, and I can tell that because of that C number down at the bottom of the card. And in the 1930s, the Bureau of Pensions renumbered all the pension files for those pensioners who were still living and gave them C numbers, and so his file is actually filed under that C number at the bottom of the card. Oops. Another example is John A. Smith, whose alias was Alexander Smith. He had a widow, Susan Smith, and served in Company K of the 45th U.S. Colored Troops Infantry. On this card, there's no application shown by John. There is application information shown for his widow, and she applied in 1889 from Pennsylvania. Again, it was a two-step process, two numbers on the file. The widow's original number there on the left, the widow's certificate number on the right. This file would be filed under the widow's certificate number 494795. This card is hard to read, and the reason is that the original card was blue, and when it was microfilmed many decades ago, the blue cards did not reproduce very well. Blue cards were for men who served in the Navy. So at the top, you still have his name with two aliases. You have his widow, and then you have the information about the ships upon which he served and the dates during which he served in the U.S. Navy. And then down at the bottom, you have the application number and the certificate numbers for both him and his wife. And then at the very bottom, it indicates the date that he died in Baltimore, Maryland in 1918. So Civil War and later military pension files, and again, the speaker next hour will give you some more details, but they include a declaration for pension, which is the pension application or an increase, an application for an increase of pension. They include affidavits by family, friends, and neighbors who provide testimony about the identity of the veteran or the widow, medical conditions of the veteran, evidence of marriage of the wife, evidence of dates of birth and parentage of minor children. There may be medical examinations by a board of physicians, correspondence about the pension claim, and perhaps reports by special examiners sent to investigate the validity of the claim. So how does this help you? Well, the affidavits, the special examiner's reports, and other records in the file may indicate when and where the former slave was born, married, and died. It may provide the name of his and or his widow's former slave owners, and it would certainly help you identify the geographic area where the veteran and widow lived during and after slavery, which helps focus your subsequent research. For example, giving you the pension file of Molly Smith, widow of Sergeant Samuel Smith, Company D, 119th U.S. Colored Troops Infantry. This file is online in our catalog. It includes an affidavit by Samuel Smith of Kentucky, dated April 9, 1909, in which he identifies his birth date as April 14, 1833, and his former slave owner as Elisha Smith, who died in 1866. There's also a second affidavit in the file which provides slightly conflicting information in which it identifies his former slave owner as Elijah Smith. So here's the April 1909 affidavit, and on the right is the enlargement in which it indicates its birth date of April 14, 1833, that his owner was Elisha Smith, that Elisha Smith made a record of his birth in the family Bible, that Elisha Smith died in 1866, and when the widow moved to Illinois, and Samuel has no idea whether the widow is alive or where the Bible is. So details like this is what you will find in pension files that may help you. Now, Samuel's widow, when she went to apply for a pension, there are affidavits in the file made in 1910 by Mary Carter and Mary Miller, who identify Molly Smith as having belonged to their family as a slave. It's not very specific on who exactly she belonged to, but they say she belonged to their family as a slave. And they also indicate when they were married and that they remarried after 1865 when it became legal for them to do so. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of pension files, and now I'd like to move on to service records. Certainly the pension file tells you the military unit in which the soldier served or the sailor served, and that's very helpful. And probably 90% to 95% of Civil War veterans received a pension. But if they didn't receive a pension, you still, of course, want to look for the service record. So the thing that will help you, which is free and online, is the National Park Service Civil War Soldiers and Sailors Database, which was compiled from records in our custody. And I'll give you the links there. This is what it looks like, their nice splash page. And in addition to providing an index to information about what military units soldiers and sailors served in, they also provide information about what battles the various regiments fought in, and sites and the historic sites at which they fought. So there's a lot of information on the site. The sailors part includes information about some 18,000 African American men who served in the Navy. So some folks did a compilation that saved you a lot of work, but you can use that information then to look at the original records that are in our custody. In terms of the Army, those who served in the Army, the U.S. Colored Troop compiled military service records have been microfilmed and can be found online. Most complete collection is on fold3.com. There are some in the National Archives catalog at this time. Any compiled military service records that have not been digitized may be ordered from the National Archives, and we provide you information on our website. So what is a compiled military service record? Well, as the word compiled suggests, the information was compiled from other sources. From the 1880s through the early 1910s, the War Department went through its muster rolls, hospital records, company descriptive books, payrolls, and other records to compile in one place, sort of one-stop shopping, information about the military service record of each soldier. And this made it easier for the War Department to answer inquiries from the Pension Office about the nature of any given individual's service. So to give you an example of what this looks like, this is Troop Smith, his first name is Troop, from Company F of the 15th U.S. Colored Troops Infantry. His entire compiled military service record is online in our catalog, and I give you 3 images here. The image at the left is the jacket. That's the envelope in which the cards that are inside are kept. And in the middle image, I give you the company descriptive book, which indicates his age as 18 years, and it also gives his physical description in terms of height, complexion, eye color, and hair color. Indicates he was born in Georgia, which could be helpful, and indicates when and where he enlisted. So it's another point in the timeline of his life where he was at the time that he enlisted. The card on the right is just one of the company muster roll cards in that file. It indicates he was absent from duty in January and February of 1866 because he had been sick in Nashville, Tennessee since August of 1865. So he was probably not actually with his unit for quite a while there. So that's an idea, gives you an idea of what a compiled military service record is. In 1866, Congress authorized the War Department to create 6 regiments of African American soldiers who became known as the Buffalo Soldiers because they served out west, and do check for a pension for them. And in the handout, we give you a link to another handout that provides information on how you research their service records. Moving on to Confederate Slave Payrolls, it's a relatively unknown fact that the Confederate government required slave owners, or at least some slave owners, to provide slaves to work on Confederate fortifications during the Civil War. So these payrolls indicate the name of the slave owner, the name of the slave, the number of days they worked, where they worked, and how much the slave owner was paid for their service. A few payrolls include white employees, African Americans, free African Americans, or notations that a particular slave escaped or absconded. And these slave payrolls are being put online in our catalog, and we give you the link in the handout and on the screen. As an example, this is Slave Payroll 67, which happens to be blue in color. They actually come in various colors of off-white, blue, yellow, orange, green, brown, and even pink. And this one is from Nottoway County, Virginia, for work performed by slaves at Fort Clifton, Virginia in May and June of 1862. And you see in the left column the name of the slave owner, the second column the name of the slave, the third column the number of days employed, the fourth column the rate of pay. Here it was $10 a month. The next column the amount that they were paid based on the number of days they worked. A total, and then the slave owner had to appear in person to get payment. If the slave owner could not appear in person to get payment, then he or she could sign a power of attorney to authorize another individual to receive payment on their behalf. And those powers of attorney are also in the files and are included online. This is Slave Payroll 3831, which is one of the payrolls that provides an example of slaves that ran away. These are slaves employed at Macon, Georgia laboratories in August of 1864, which likewise names the slaves their owners and the date they ran away between August and October of 1864. So moving on now to the Bureau of Pensions Law Division case files. The Bureau of Pensions, otherwise known as the Pension Office, had a law division that was responsible for prosecuting pension fraud, promoting compliance with legal requirements, answering inquiries about legal questions, making sure attorneys didn't cheat their clients, and things of that nature. And the series has the long and complex title of Case Files of Attorneys, Agents, Pensioners, and Others Relating to the Prosecution of Pension Claims and the Investigation of Fraudulent Practices. So that's why I condensed the title down to Law Division Case Files, because that's just so long. Some of these files actually include letters or testimony that identify former slave owners and changes in names, and other files provide information about ex-slave pension clubs. These are images from the case file of Samuel Christian, who was a janitor in a post office, and he was trying to start a sideline business helping pension claimants prosecute their claims. Unfortunately, government employees aren't allowed to prosecute claims against the government, so he wasn't allowed to do that. But he was explaining to the pension office, to the law division, why he was known as both Samuel McLean and Samuel Christian. And so he says that I was a slave of Jackson McLean of Henderson County, Kentucky at the time I went into the Army. I was also a slave of John Christian before I was a slave of Jackson McLean. And so that's his explanation of why he was also known as Samuel McLean. So in the late 1800s, there was a man named Vaughan that tried to get Congress to enact a pension law to allow former slaves a pension. Congress never enacted such a law, but it provided the opportunity for imposters to go around claiming that they were from the government and for the low fee of 25 cents or whatever, would enroll you on the list of pension claimants. because this is back in the day when there's no internet and news isn't very good, and so people would fall for that kind of thing. So the law division ended up investigating a lot of different people who claimed to be ex-slave pension law imposters because of their fraudulent activities. But there was also perfectly legal activities, and those perfectly legal activities were to organize ex-slave pension clubs. And as long as you didn't say you were from the government, and that was fine. So this is a flyer that was printed by D.O. Fleming, who was a white printer in Tennessee, for a convention of ex-slaves. And he sent this into the government because he was concerned that former slaves were being duped of their hard-earned money by people telling them that they were going to get a pension. So the interesting thing about this flyer is that it lists some of the people that were officers of that club. So I thought that was helpful and useful and certainly interesting. And if you had somebody living in there at that time, this might have been an activity that they were involved in. So moving on now to the Freedmen's Bureau records. The Freedmen's Bureau, whose formal name was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, was established by Congress in 1865 to help the former slaves as well as poor whites in the aftermath of the Civil War. They provided food, housing, and medical aid, established schools, and offered legal assistance. There are basically three bodies of records created by the Freedmen's Bureau that are of interest that we'll talk about here today. The first are the marriage records, which have been microfilmed and you can find online. And during slave times, these slaves were not allowed to legally marry. Their marriages were not recognized by law. And so after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau basically remarried slaves who wished to do that, sort of a recognition of a marriage that already occurred. And this is an example of the marriage or remarriage record of Miles Fite and his wife Nancy Jane Fite, who had been married already about 2 years and had a child named Laura John, is how it's indicated here, probably Laura Jane, but Laura Jane Fite aged about 1 year, and it helpfully indicates Nancy Jane formerly belonged to Barry White. I looked him up, his full name is Bartholomew, and was the daughter of B.B. Manson. So a lot of information packed into this one little form right here, dated April 19, 1866, about a year after the Civil War. So very helpful information. The records of the assistant commissioners for each state contain a variety of correspondence and records about various subjects, and not all states are going to have all types of records, and not all counties are going to have all types of records. But among the things that you might find are indentures, which are either contracts for an apprenticeship or support, or contracts for other purposes, employment contracts, records about land and property, transportation, the hiring of people and things, oaths of office, court cases, criminal activities, and rations of food and clothing. So as an example of things that you might find in here, this is the indenture of apprenticeship for Neil and Ellen, orphans, formerly property of the mother-in-law of James McCallum of Robeson County, North Carolina, dated April 14, 1865. So these orphans, presumably their parents are both dead, needed somebody to support them, and James McCallum is agreeing in this contract with a representative of the Freedmen's Bureau to support them until they're age 21. Presumably they also have to do some work for him too. But again, it gives that link back into slave times and why they are with him and how they came to be there. So a very useful record. Another example are these charts, which are reports of outrages or crimes committed against, one is for crimes committed by whites against blacks, the other of blacks against whites, and this is from August of 1867 in North Carolina. So if your ancestor was unfortunately involved in one of these things, that there's at least a record of it, and helps, again, put them before 1870 back close to the Civil War. This is an indenture or a contract in which S.W. Ashley pays 25 bushels of corn to Charles Ashley, who's designated as a freedman, who agrees to take himself and his family immediately away from the house of S.W. Ashley of Lumberton, North Carolina, August 25, 1865. So as I read this, I assume that Charles Ashley and his wife were formerly the slaves of S.W. Ashley, and he just can't support them anymore, doesn't want them anymore, and so he's giving them something of value to go away. So that puts you right at the doorstep of the end of the Civil War, and just a wonderful, wonderful record to help you get back further in time. So the field offices also have a variety of records, and this is an example of a register of sick and wounded at Lincoln Hospital in Savannah, Georgia, from September of 1865 to April of 1867. Some of the people on the ledger died, but it indicates, besides their name, their illness and whether they're a freedman or a refugee, what their status is. So it could be a useful record there too. Another example is the labor contract between GMD Patterson of Alabama and his former quote-unquote servants, Louisa and her children, who are named, Nicey and her children, who are named, Felix and his family, who are all named. So again, it helps, and this is dated 1866. So again, right at the end of the Civil War, you've got the slave owners, his former slaves, and their family units. So a very useful record. Moving on now to the Freedmen Savings and Trust Company, otherwise known as the Freedmen's Bank. It was established to protect the interests of depositors and their heirs in the event of a depositor's death. The bank branches collected a substantial amount of detailed information about the depositor and his family. So the registers of depositors have been microfilmed, and they're available online. There are 55 volumes of signatures and personal identification of about 67,000 depositors in 29 bank branches, which includes, among other things, besides the name of the depositor, the name that they opened the account, the date of birth, the place brought up, the residence, age, name of employer or occupation, wife or husband, children, father, mother, brothers, sisters, remarks, and signature. It may also contain the name of the former owner and the name of the plantation, and for those who are died, there may be a copy of the death certificate. So I just pulled one page at random. This is from Lynchburg, Virginia in 1871. Look at the top half here. So we have Robert Ransom here, who established the account in 1871. He was born in Appomattox, still living in Appomattox, age 56. He has a wife, Martha. He has 6 children who are named right there. Names his father, Thomas Ransom, and his mother, Susan Ransom. Names his siblings, most of whom are dead. A lot of information. Wonderful thing there. On the right is Lewis H. Jones from Cameron, Virginia, who has a whole lot less information. He says he doesn't know whether his parents are living, and he apparently doesn't have a spouse or any children. So a lot less for him. And at the bottom of that same page, John Walker, also from Appomattox, has a wife, no children, his parents are dead, but it indicates some siblings. So besides the 67,000 depositors, there are a whole lot of names in the register of depositors, and so it's a very valuable source to help fill out some family trees. I'd like to move on to the dividend and payment record of the Freedmen Savings and Trust Company. This is online in our catalog, and although it doesn't really provide any personal information about the depositors, it does provide some financial information, and it is free and online. This is when you go to the catalog and you see the list of records that it has, the list of file units. This is what you see at the very beginning of that list. And then you click on one of those. I clicked on Macon, Georgia, and chose page 11. And you see there in the widest columns, the widest column, the name of the depositor, and then the amounts that are involved there. So again, it's financial information, but if you have someone who is had enough means by this point in time, it's a good resource, and it's free and online. Moving on to the Southern Claims Commission case files. The Southern Claims Commission was established by Congress to provide compensation for citizens of southern states who had suffered property damage or loss by federal troops during the Civil War. Claimants were required to prove their losses and that they had remained loyal to the Union during the war. well, besides people who were loyal to the Union during the war, there are a lot of people who weren't loyal to the Union during the war who also applied. So don't assume that you won't find any particular person in there, because they very well may be there. But the typical claims file include the claimant's petition, inventories of supplies and property for which compensation was desired, the testimony of the claimant and others, both favorable and adverse, a copy of the commission's report, and for approved claims, a certificate of settlement from the third auditor of the Treasury. Former slaves sometimes testified on behalf of their former masters and sometimes submitted claims themselves. And as an example of this, I give you the claims file of Emily Frazier of Limestone County, Alabama, which is online in our catalog. She was a former slave of William Richardson, she claimed loss of a mule and some hogs. The entire file is 47 images, so there's lots of detail about her life there, and I show on the screen the first 2 pages of her testimony. So a very useful resource. The Coastwise Slave Ship Manifests may be helpful. The Act of March 2, 1807 outlawed the importation of African slaves effective on January 1, 1808. However, shipment of slaves between U.S. ports, the coastwise trade, was still permitted. To prove that slaves on board a vessel were not illegally imported, the captain or master filed a manifest, a list, at the port of departure and at the port of arrival. Now, a lot of the records have not survived, but those that have survived are available for your use. The records for New Orleans are the most extensive of them, and they have been microfilmed and are online. This is an example from New Orleans of an inward manifest, a ship arriving at New Orleans. It's the ship Marathon, which departed from Savannah, Georgia on December 15, 1826, and arrived at New Orleans on January 4, 1827. Ethan Allen, the shipper, resides at Franklin, Louisiana. There are 4 slaves listed here, Joe, William, Lincoln, and Louisa, and it gives their gender, their age, their height, and complexion. And in the owner or shipper column, it doesn't specify owner or shipper, so you have to go to the reverse side of the document, which is the next image online, and that's the back side, in which on this page, Ethan Allen is indicated to be the shipper. So you don't know who the slave owner had been, you don't know who the slave owner was going to become, but you know at this moment in time that those particular individuals were in the custody of Ethan Allen. Moving on now to the records of the Board of Commissioners for the Emancipation of Slaves in the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia, being federal land not within the bounds of any state, is subject to special acts of Congress, and in April of 1862, the District of Columbia compensated Emancipation Act, ended slavery, and paid slave owners for releasing their slaves. And to get compensation, the slave owners would have to submit a petition. So this is petition number 609 by James S. Morsel for freeing Priscilla Quad, whose age and description is provided in the petition. So good information there. So if you have somebody from the district, this is a good source. Fugitive slave case records, petitions, files, and so forth are found in federal courts. The federal courts were sometimes involved in the legal process by which slave owners retrieved escaped enslaved persons, which was governed by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 as amended by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And these records are in our regional archives, which hold district court and circuit court records. And as one example of this is the petition of John Geither of Baltimore, Maryland, who sought the return of Henry Watts, age 33, in October of 1851. Moving on finally to the last group of records that I'm going to talk about today, and circling back to the idea of reasonably exhaustive research, you just never know where you're going to find information. The District of Columbia records that we have include mug books from the District of Columbia Police for the 1880s that include images of over 700 persons, most of whom are male, most of whom are white, but there are some African Americans in the collection. Some of the mugshots are of individuals that were wanted by the New York City or Philadelphia police departments. So those are cards provided by those police departments to the Washington, D.C. Police Department. But other cards, such as the two that I'm going to show you, are mugshots that were taken by the District of Columbia Police themselves after the arrest of these individuals. So here is Henry Jackson, who was born in Virginia, as it says on the card, B.A., about 1855, based on his age of 32 years when he was arrested in 1887. I felt that he was possibly an ex-slave because he was born in Virginia before the end of the Civil War. And so it's, that would be subject to further research of someone who would be interested in that. But again, it's a possible former ex-slave for whom there is an image. And here's another one, also born before the end of the Civil War. Armstead Ward was born at Leesburg, Virginia, about 1862. So he was a child at the time of the Civil War, and this is his picture when he was arrested in 1889. So leave no stone unturned, do reasonably exhaustive research. The best way to learn the records that are out there is to really take a look at the records. And far too many people just sort of collect. They go, they find something, they print it out, and they move on without stopping to study other pages of the same record to figure out what they can really learn from it. And I am now open for questions.
Thank you, Claire. Wow, tons of great information. We do have several questions that came online, so let me cue those up. So going back almost towards the beginning of your presentation, we had a question about the 1900 census. So the person says, the 1900 census indicates my great-grandfather served in the Confederate Army as an African American. If he was a servant to a soldier, are there any records for that?
The Confederate records overall are fairly poor because, there was, as the Confederate states were losing the war, a lot of records were lost. But for a person to be a servant of an officer or a soldier, there would not be a record because that would be basically a contract, as it were, between that soldier or officer and their servant.
Yeah. So I have a question. Someone says, my great-grandfather, who was a slave, served in the Confederate Army. Someone told me that the Confederate pension records, there are many more pages than what is available online. There are about 5 pages showing his pension record online. Are there possibly more? And someone suggested look on the state archives.
Right. So the National Archives does not have Confederate pensions because the U.S. government, the federal government, did not grant pensions to Confederates until the late 1950s. So the Confederate pensions that are out there were granted by state governments, and you can find and the information and all those records you can find at the state archive, various state archives, some of which have digitized their records and put them online. My understanding is that the very skimpy files that you find online for Confederate files, the pension files, that's it. That is my understanding that is it. But if you have a specific question, you should contact the state archives and get clarification from them.
Thank you very much. Being very specific, in Washington, D.C., someone asked specifically, do you only have arrest records for Washington, D.C.?
Well, yes. The arrest records, those are generated at the local level. Those would be local records in the places out there. They're not federal records. Washington, D.C. is kind of unique because it is federal land, not within the boundaries of any state. So the National Archives has records from the District of Columbia. There's a District of Columbia archives as well, and then District of Columbia records offices also have records. So it can be very confusing for researchers to know where to go. But yes, we would only have really old District of Columbia criminal records.
Thank you. And I know, this is Andrea, I'll interject that we've had a Know Your Records in the past by Damani Davis about records on Washington, D.C. If you look back on the Know Your Records lectures. So moving on, I know we've been talking a lot about digital resources. Fair enough if you don't know the answer to this one. Someone asked, will Deborah Newman Ham's publication, The Black History, A Guide to Civilian Records, pardon me, things are changing while I'm looking at, A Guide to Civilian Records in the National Archives, will it be updated to include digital resources?
The updating of NARA publications is outside my office's scope of work. You know, I don't know that we would necessarily do that. I think going forward, the plan, a large portion of the plan is to update the catalog to provide information, but I can't really speak to that.
Fair enough. I think that would have been a good question for our previous presenters on the catalog. They might know. Moving on, let's see, we have a question. If you are having a difficult time tracing a branch of ancestors during this time frame, is there a place you would recommend beginning research if you know that they had hired slaves?
Well, besides the things I've already mentioned, and besides, I mean, I'm not sure that I can recommend any particular thing. I mean, the records generated in any particular locale are going to vary, and certainly in many parts of the South, there was record loss due to the Civil War, as well as to courthouse fires that had nothing to do with war. So there's nothing in particular. I mean, there's no magic bullet. There's no magic. There's no magic here. It's just a matter of going through all the records and being very thorough, and seeking out as much information as you can from all sources. It's a good thing to network with other genealogists. There's the Afro-American Genealogical and Historical Society, and they would certainly be an excellent resource for this topic.
Thank you. Our next question. Where are the original records of the Slave Ship Manifest? Some of those records are hard to read online.
The Slave Ship Manifests are largely in the regional archives that serves the state for which those manifests are located. So for example, the New Orleans Slave Ship Manifest would be at our regional archives in Fort Worth, because Fort Worth services Louisiana and other states in that vicinity.
Yeah, very good.
So if you go into the catalog, you're looking at it in our catalog, you would then, under the contact information, it would indicate which facility has those records.
So it sounds like we can still go to that facility and pull those records if.
In general, you know, in general, the policy of the archives is once it's microfilmed or digitized, we don't pull the original unless it is unreadable in the microfilmed or digital format. So, you know, that's something for you to work out with the reference staff at the facility that has custody of the records. And in many cases, you know, a lot of old records may very well have faded ink, and they may not be any better when you see them in person.
Yeah, thank you so much. This next question is about the 1890 census records. Do the surviving 1890 census records cover any particular regional area of the U.S.?
So the 1890 census pages that survived are for a scattering of places, and if you visit the 1890 census page that's provided in the handout, that will give you a list of the places that are included.
Oh, very perfect. And I will remind everybody that you can find Claire's handout on the Genealogy Fair webpage, along with everybody else's handout. And all of these videos and handouts will remain online, as well as former Genealogy Fair presentations are still available for you to look at and enjoy.
And in addition, if you use a search engine like Google and you search for archives.gov and the words 1890 census, that 1890 census page will probably be one of the top hits.
Ooh, that's a good tip. Thank you. So I'm looking back at our chat to see if we have any more questions. I think our last one was answered. Thank you so much for this in-depth lecture. We really appreciate it. People are saying thank you very much to you. You're getting a lot of kudos online. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. So with that, we'll conclude this presentation. If we don't get to your question, please submit it to inquire@nara.gov.